everybody, this is Emerson Forrest, and this is my second time being in one of Dr. Graves' poetry classes, and I'm so honored to get to talk to you today. So today I'm going to be discussing William Blake London. Before we get started on that poem, I want to go ahead and give you some biographical information on Blake. So who was Blake? Blake was one of 7 children born to James and Catherine Blake. He was born November 28th, 1757. At the age of 10, he was enrolled in Parr's Drawing School, and after a 4-year course, he ended up training as an apprentice under James Besire. During that time, he was trained as an engraver and learned how to create beautiful art. Quickly after, he was enrolled at the Royal Academy, and Blake went on to marry Catherine Boucher. Something interesting about the relationship that he had with Catherine Boucher is that during the time, women weren't allowed, or rather weren't taught to read and write. So Blake actually went on to teach his wife, Catherine, how to read and to write, and she ended up being somebody who helped him immensely in his design and art throughout his career, which is really incredible. Eventually, as time progressed, his younger brother Robert, who he was very close to, became ill, and he ended up caring for Robert at the end of his life and said, quote, "At the last solemn moment, the visionary eyes beheld the released spirit ascend heavenward through the matter-of-fact ceiling, clapping its hands for joy." I think that this statement is really powerful because it's just the observation of somebody passing from how we know them materially into a spiritual realm. And among his greater accomplishment, he was also recognized as one of the poets belonging to the Romantic movement. And so I want to educate you on that further. So who are the Romantic poets and what is the Romantic movement? So the English poets who are part of the English Romantic period lived during the mid-1700s to late 1800s, although that timeline can be shifted a little bit, perhaps narrowed depending on who you're discussing it with. They focus primarily on the imagination as a driving force of creation, and it allowed essentially for an access to deeper truths and revelation of the material they decided to cover in their work. They sought the divine through the medium of nature and focused specifically on encapsulation of the sublime. So what that looks like is grandeur. It's looking at the bigger picture that you can't actually take in all at once. So it's this idea that something so large, so grand, that is typically found in nature, it's a large-scale thing, is so awe-inspiring that it essentially just awakens within you some incredible inspiration. That's essentially what the sublime is. They also brought the common people, or the poor, into subject matter, into poetry. So previously, poetry was seen as essentially an aristocratic medium. It was not something accessible to the poor, nor should you discuss poor topics with it. So through some of their metrical and technical skill, they ended up incorporating the common language into an aristocratic medium, as well as the subject matter itself, discussing things like poverty and situations of the poor. Blake was one of the first of the Romantic poets, situating himself in the first generation as opposed to the second generation of the Romantic poets. He was established in that first generation alongside William Wordsworth and Coleridge. The first generation focused primarily on nature and one's individual's emotion and the expression of those emotions, whereas the second, which include Byron, Keats, and Shelley, ended up dealing with abstraction and individual freedom. So, with all of that in mind, let's go ahead and get started on London. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow. A mark in every face I meet, marks of sadness, marks of woe. And every cry of every man, and every infant's cry of fear, and every voice, and every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldiers sigh, runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plague the marriage hearse. Alright, so London is a very rich poem, and its first thing that I want to go over is the structure. So it is an iambic tetrameter, which means that it has 4 feet of syllables in the iambic meter, so that has to do with the stress pattern. And its rhyme is A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, and continues down the poem, specifically noting that the D rhyme does appear later in the poem in that last stanza again. It utilizes many different literary tools that I'm about to go over, and it has such instinctual and detailed skill interwoven throughout the entire thing that really ought to be noted. So, the first thing that I want to note is the alliteration seen in the first stanza. So, in the first stanza, specifically lines 3 and 4, we see this repetition of M in marks, meet, and then marks again, and then weakness and woe. What this does is it allows you first to build momentum as you're repeating these sounds, as well as allowing you to think a little bit harder unconsciously about the words that he's choosing. So when he said, and mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe, what he's saying in that third line is he's remarking, he's noting these different facial expressions or marks that he sees on the individuals that he's passing by. You also see in the second stanza in line 8 this recharacterization of the M, first introduced in line 5 again with man, but then more strongly reinforced in mind-forged manacles. The next literary tool that he uses is anaphora, which is essentially just the repetition of phrases, and sometimes it can be a single word. So you see in every repeated continually, that's in line 3, 5, 6, and 7. In every, what that makes you consider is every instance that this thing is happening, in every face, in every cry, in every infant, in every voice. So it takes it from this broad scope of grandeur into the individual scope of every individual he's meeting, and it helps you connect as an audience with the people he's describing in the poem. The next thing he utilizes is assonance, which is a repetition of vowels. And so wander and woe, these long stretched out vowels, which help emphasize maybe those specific words again with just that mental resonance, and also can help conflate those emotions. When you're in woe, you're sighing, it's breathy. The next thing I want to go over is the interwoven skills. So specifically, he deals with associations in this poem, and he does that within itself. It's contextualized within itself, and he does this through rhymes. So when you look at stanza 2, you see at the end of each line these different rhymes, that C, D, C, D. And what happens in this is that the first rhyme, C, is actually the catalyst for the second rhyme. And so in line 5, when he says man is actually the catalyst of these bands. And these bands happen to be legal bands happening throughout England that contextualize some of the suffering during this time. Additionally, you see in every infant's cry of fear, and then mind-forged manacles I hear. So fear and hear, well, if it's the cry, you're hearing that cry, and that cry is coming out of fear. And so he kind of reutilizes this rhyme again to draw on the senses, that when you hear something, that it's also enacting this certain emotion out of those experiencing it. And those mind-forged manacles are essentially this this mental chain that happens to exist in all of the poor, impoverished people at the time. The next thing I want to go over is the symbolism he uses. Specifically, I want to look at blackening and blight. So when you look at line 10 in line 16, you see blackening and blight, and these two things reflect each other. So when you see the blackening church, it is a blight upon the church. And in the same way that the church is constructed as a marriage, these blight upon marriages that the harlot is enacting reflect that same blight that the church is enacting. And so it's something that's really interesting that you see this kind of hearkening back to earlier language within the entire poem. Next, you have his allusions, which is just very brief. He says, how the chimney sweepers cry. So this poem is specifically a part of his collection called Songs of Innocence and Experience, specifically belonging to the latter experience poems. And he has two different poems, one in Innocence and an Experience, about chimney sweepers that I recommend you go ahead and read if you're interested in learning more. And he's hearkening back to these two poems because this poem is actually introduced later in that volume after he's already written, and the audience should have already read those two poems. So he's hearkening it back. It's a self-allusion to his own work, and I think that's important to note here when you do study this work. The next literary tool that I think it's important to look at is irony. So he uses irony in a very interesting way in this poem. So what you see as the first set of ironical pairs is the church and the harlot's curse. So these two things are interesting because what they do is they're actually the authority figures who cause the suffering that they're meant to endure. So how the church appalls the cry, well, they're actually partially responsible for that cry. And again, those two chimney sweeper poems are going to provide a greater context than I can in a brief video. But it's interesting to look at how the church is actually responsible for the cry that it appalls. Appall also has two different meanings here because you have the literal act of appalling or being disgusted or revolted to something. And then you also have the like a pallbearer, meaning death, which is something that these chimney sweepers, which were kids, would have experienced. So it's all kind of intertwined again, greater expansion in his other poems. And then you have the harlot's curse, which she's cursing the tear or the sound or the cry of the infant that you see earlier in the poem, but then again brought back up in that second to last line where the harlot is actually responsible for the things she's rebuking. The next thing that you see is the palace and the church. And so these two images of authority again are responsible for the thing that they're associated with. So the church is responsible to some extent for not alleviating the suffering of the kids who end up being these chimney sweepers. And the palace is actually responsible for sending out these soldiers. This is hapless soldiers' sight. It's the death of these soldiers that the palace is responsible for. And so the irony is that these two authority figures are suffering under something that they're causing themselves. The last thing I want to go over for this is midnight. So the irony of midnight in the 13th line is that, but must through midnight streets I hear. Midnight, when you think of night, it's typically a veil of some sort for secrecy, for cover, that maybe the things that happen at night aren't recognized in the public. But Blake actually opposes this idea very strongly in this poem, saying that despite the fact that it's midnight, that things that are going on that may not be favorable, they're actually still being recognized. They're no longer in secrecy because it's such a commonplace thing that anybody walking the streets actually becomes an observer of the suffering and the woe going on in the world. So yeah, so there's a brief explication on William Blake's London. It's an amazing work that I recommend you look a little bit more deeply into, and I hope that you've enjoyed this explanation, and yeah, I hope you guys just have a good time. Bye.